Let's talk about the impacts of climate change, which many of you, most of you may be familiar with, but I want to try to think about it, framing it as how it impacts our food systems. So, first let's look at global impacts. So global average temperatures from 1850 to 2020, steadily increasing. That's not good. That means significant warming globally and not just locally. And it also has a lot of impacts in terms of our climate. So here's a few of those. So one, regarding farming, this is probably the most interesting to me. And because I work with a lot of school gardens, this has come up multiple times. Climate change has changed the growing seasons for a lot of communities. So one of the schools we work with in Tucson, Arizona, has a large mural that demonstrates a Tohono O'odham calendar. Tohono O'odham is one of the First Nation groups in Arizona. And this community has documented seasonal changes for generations. And the mural that they have demonstrates, what you should expect to see in the garden month by month. And about 3 or 4 years ago, students began to notice that things had changed. They no longer saw certain native plants flowering in alignment with that Tohono O'odham calendar, and instead they were coming earlier, or certain crops were not growing as well because of they were being planted at the wrong time. And so they've been discussing how to update that calendar. So it changes growing seasons depending on where you are. That might mean a longer growing season because there are fewer frost days. So you can start growing earlier and you can grow later into the year. In Arizona, it means that we've shifted away from growing anything in the summer to growing things primarily in late winter and through the spring, or starting late in the summer and growing through fall almost too. So it's almost like we don't have winter to stop our growing, it's the summer that stops our growing. And then other places, it means it impacts fruit trees. So a lot of fruit trees need a period of frost or they won't flower. And if you don't have those frost days, it means that your trees won't flower and they won't fruit. Precipitation has changed as well. This map is from the United States, obviously, but you can see the precipitation has changed. The green represents the changes in precipitation, more precipitation. The brown represents less precipitation. So you can see the change in precipitation. In some areas, it's gotten drier. There are more droughts. In other areas, there's more floods and more storms. And so again, this is why we say climate change and not necessarily global warming as often anymore, because we've really started to get granular about how the climate is changing across the globe. Extreme heat. This is from just the other day, 114 in Portland, hotter in Portland than it was in Phoenix. That's insane, insane. 24 million people under heat alerts and all-time record highs. So extreme heat, definitely one of the global impacts of climate change. We get more frequent and more powerful hurricanes as well, which is something that impacts you folks in Florida for sure. So the frequency of tropical storms, which are the storms that can become hurricanes, has increased. And then there's the strength of North Atlantic hurricanes has increased as well. So we're getting more storms and more powerful storms. Satellite data shows that sea level is rising. The mechanism behind this is really is not straightforward. It's the result of two things. As ice that is on land, so not Arctic ice, but Antarctic ice and glaciers that are situated above sea level, as they start to melt, that melted ice goes into the oceans and causes an increase. But the biggest increase in terms of sea level is due to the fact that as substances heat up, they expand. For some reason, a lot of people misunderstand that that when water freezes, it does expand, but water isn't. So a lot of times I've heard from students or from other folks that water is different from other materials because as it gets colder, it expands, whereas other materials expand as they get warmer. That's not true. Water expands as it heats up. It's just that when it freezes, it becomes less dense because of the crystal structure that it has to have. So it becomes a crystal and there's more space in between molecules. When all substances heat up, the molecules move faster and they bounce against each other, and that makes them spread out. So water does increase due to heat, and that seems to be the main reason that we have sea level rise. And then this is another global problem, nearly 50% reduction in our Arctic ice. Again, not necessarily contributing to sea level rise, but definitely changing the climate there. There's lots and lots of organisms in North America and Greenland that rely on some sea ice in order to find food or seek shelter. And so the reduction of that sea ice is a problem. One of, I think, the most important discussions about the impacts of climate change is this graph that I showed you earlier, showing you the health impacts that result from climate change. So rising temperatures mean more frequent heat waves, hotter cities, and that leads to dehydration, to heat stroke, et cetera. That also aggravates cardiovascular illnesses and respiratory illnesses. I have asthma. I've had asthma since I was a child. As days have gotten warmer, I noticed that I'm more prone to asthma issues through the summer. So when I was a kid, I could spend most of the time out in the summer and not worry about the heat impacting my asthma. But now, once the days start to get over about 105, I have to be really careful and carry my inhalers everywhere because it gets up to be a problem. Climate change also means extreme weather. So that's flooding, that's storms, that's intense wildfires, and that leads to property loss, water contamination, that can kill people or make people sick. There's air quality impacts. So one of the things we'll discuss in a little bit in relation to Florida is that as temperature increases, it becomes harder for greenhouse gases and pollution to be just diffused in the atmosphere. And so they just sort of sit on top of cities. So you get these really problematic environmental conditions on the ground. Also, air quality is impacted by increased allergens, and that means you have worse allergies than ever, and maybe that influences cardiovascular illness and respiratory illness as well. And then probably the most concerning to me is that the vector-borne diseases, so those are diseases like malaria, et cetera, that are carried by mosquitoes. The increased temperature and humidity in the southern United States as the result of climate change has allowed for mosquitoes that normally live in tropical areas to expand northward. So we're starting to see malaria cases moving and creeping north from the tropics because the mosquitoes have a wider range. And so that's a problem. So malaria, Zika virus, West Nile virus, all of those things, all of those diseases carried by mosquitoes are going to be a bigger problem. All right, so let's shift a little bit and talk about impacts that are specific to the United States. And so one of the obvious tie-ins is the temperature increases. So here, this map shows the US annual temperature compared to 20th century baseline average. And what you see is that in the 1900s, you had relatively cooler, that's what the blue represents, relatively cooler temperatures across the United States. And as we have moved toward 2020, you can see that those temperatures have really increased. And so now here's our heat map. We're in 1 degree Fahrenheit above that baseline. And so almost across the entire US. And look at Florida, for example, look at Arizona. Those are the places where those temperature increases are really problematic. That's not the only concern. In the United States, climate change also has an impact on economics as well. So this map represents the total economic damage of climate change. And that means in terms of percentage of county GDP. So what that means is that you have floods, you have extreme heat, you have infrastructure damage, like roads buckling or bridges collapsing, or needing to replace structures in the city that are damaged by heat. In Arizona, we're well adapted to that because we use rubberized asphalt, which allows for the roads to expand and contract. But if you go into areas that have been redlined, I used to live in one of these neighborhoods that is a low income area and didn't have much support from the city in terms of infrastructure. You can see the roads are potholed because they haven't been updated and maintained, but you see it most in the sidewalks. The sidewalks expand and buckle and crack and break apart. And so there'll be like huge changes in the climate, in the sidewalk that are the result of heat. And so also another thing to point out is that most of this is concentrated along the southern United States. Not only is this where climate change is causing higher temperatures, it's also tends to be states that put less money into their infrastructure to begin with. And so that can be something that results in just further economic loss. So another problem is that changes in climate result in changes in rainfall, and increasing heat dries out vegetation that is not getting the rainfall that it needs. And so what we see in lots of different regions is an increased risk of fire. So in the Pacific Northwest, in California, in Arizona, and it looks like in Florida as well, that has been a particular problem. And there's, lots of commentary about how to deal with this, in terms of, going into forests and managing them better. But the bottom line is that it's related to climate change, and so we also need to address that problem. How does that happen? Well, as I mentioned, as temperature increases, snow melts sooner, and when it melts sooner, that the forest may not be ready for it. So the forest might still be dormant due to winter. And if they're not ready to absorb all of that water and start to put it into their tissues, then it just runs off into rivers, and it might even cause flooding. And then forests are drier, and they're drier longer. And as a result of that, then you have these conditions for forest fire. Another related problem is tree migrations. How many of you knew that trees migrate? I was shocked to find this out, and it's really interesting. We have pretty good data that shows that certain kinds of forests are moving north. Their range is expanding north at a really, really fast rate. And so in 30 years, this map shows on the left, you see kind of the 1960s to 1990s representation of forests. We've seen enough movement of these forests to be able to project that by 2070 and 2100, we will have a very different composition of forests in New England. So trees that typically grew along the Mason-Dixon line, it's getting too warm for them, and so they're moving north. And they're also moving west and displacing these other trees like maples and elm, ash, etc. So some of you have maple syrup. Yeah, this is why maple syrup is struggling. Yep, definitely. Some of you have maple syrup, and you should value that now, because who knows what's going to happen. Just one more slide, and then we're going to take a movement break. Flood vulnerability is another problem. So the average number of extreme high flow days and record floods by watersheds, those have increased dramatically, particularly in the eastern United States and in the South. It's gotten drier in the Southwest and drier in the Pacific Northwest. These other regions have gotten are getting increased risk of floods, and there's a lot of reasons for that, having to do with the amount of energy in the air from the heat that's trapped in the atmosphere, having to do with moisture evaporating in the Western United States and and fueling humid storm conditions as it moves to the east. And so we're becoming more and more vulnerable to floods in certain parts of the country, including Florida.